Well, good morning. Welcome. Welcome to today's Friday webinar, OSHA's revised HazCom standard presented by Adele Abrams. Thanks, Adele. It's so good to have you back. And I just want to let everyone know that has logged in this morning. I hope you're somewhere in an air-conditioned room or safely in your air-conditioned car pulled over so that you're not out in this heat. But as you're watching this webinar, we want you to engage. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A function on the Zoom. There's a chat button as well. If you put questions in, Adele will try to answer questions towards the end. And if we don't get to them today, we'll be sure to gather them and we can send that information back out to you later. You can send questions to us directly at safety@chesapeakesc.org. You can always call the council. You know, there's lots of friendly folks here to take your call. And the phone number is there on the screen. You can take a screenshot of that if you want, or a cell phone picture, so that you can reach us back later. And just as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll go ahead and post this on our website at chesapeakesc.org after this event, probably by Monday. The video recording and Adele's presentation will be available for you to view and download and share. And so feel free to continue to add things into the Q&A throughout Adele's presentation. And I just want to invite you back here. Let me get to my slide here. Invite you back for Adele's going to have another presentation July 10th on the new MSHA rules webinar. Will happen on July 10th from 9 to 10. It's another free webinar on silica and surface mobile equipment. So with that, Dave, if you'd like to introduce our esteemed presenter.
Yeah. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dave Medeiros. I'm the president of the Chesapeake Region Safety Council. Our mission is to educate and influence people to prevent accidental injury and death. We are a regional independent chapter of the National Safety Council. We're also the Mid-Atlantic OSHA Training Institute Education Center. So we're a chapter of the National Safety Council. We're an OTI Ed Center. And our mission is really simply saving lives and preventing injuries. That's what we're all about. And, you know, we kind of affectionately call events like what we're having today as our Friday freebies. It's an opportunity to present to people information that is incredibly valuable as they pursue their field of safety and health. And man, oh man, oh man, we got one of the best to present it. And I know, Adele, and when I read your name tag on the bottom, it says Esquire, but you know what? What I want to focus on is the fact that you're a safety professional and that, you know, your specialty is that you deliver the message in a way that we can understand it because you understand where we are as safety people and trying to make this stuff work in the business. So I want to say for years, we've had Adele supporting us, and she's also a past CEO of the Chesapeake Region Safety Council. And you know what? I really enjoy hearing Adele talk. Every time I've got notepads and pens and highlighters sitting right here next to my desk because I am certain there's going to be some valuable information I'm pulling out of this thing. And I will repackage it and format it in a way that it sounds like it came from me, but it really came from Adele because she's way smarter than me. All right, without further ado, I want you all to enjoy this opportunity to hear Adele talk about hazardous communications. And I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you, Adele.
Okay, and by the way, Dave, what we call that in the safety trade is R&D, rip off and duplicate. And it's okay because safety is all about sharing information. And that's, you know, really where we're coming from here. So these Friday freebies is just another way the Chesapeake Region Safety Council and its members, like me, I'm a member as well, of course, can share information amongst ourselves. So when this new rule came out that we're going to be talking about here, I was kind of surprised that it didn't get a lot of press. And HazCom is one of the most cited standards. Most of us know that. If you've ever had an OSHA inspection, it's easy pickings. It's the low-hanging fruit for OSHA to find in terms of paperwork violations, especially. And so every time there's a change, and there haven't been a lot of them, but when there is a change in the HazCom standard, there's an obligation that starts upstream with the chemical manufacturers. It also impacts importers and distributors. And I know some of those companies are members of the Chesapeake Region Safety Council, but also they are employers. Most of the folks who are members are there because they are employers. They're not necessarily in the chemical industry, but they have obligations that flow downstream to them. And then, of course, employees are the ones affected by exposures to hazardous chemicals, which is what the rule was created for really to begin with. So what has happened is that May 20th, 2024, so literally just a month ago, the final rule was published by OSHA. This amends the HazCom standard, which is codified at 29 CFR 1910.1200, and it does cover all sectors. There are no sectors of the workforce that are immune from being covered by the hazard communication standard. Now, what about mining? Because I am a certified mine safety professional, and I am going to be talking about mining for you next month. MSHA is its own agency. MSHA does have a HazCom standard, and they are back in the dark ages. Literally, they are in the 20th century. They have not even adopted the global harmonization system yet. However, they do say if you are in compliance with the current OSHA standard, then MSHA will accept that for compliance as well. So what they will not accept at a mine, and this includes contractors who may be doing work at a mine site, you can't be out of compliance with the MSHA rule and also out of compliance with the OSHA rule and assume that neither apply. One or the other you have to follow when you're there. But for purposes of this webinar, we are focusing on OSHA work sites and the OSHA rule. So I just wanted to put that out there in case there was any confusion. So on May 20th in the Federal Register, the final rule adopts the 7th revision to the United Nations Global Harmonization Standard. And most of us, have kind of put in the rearview mirror and maybe forgotten the trauma from back in 2012 when the Global Harmonization Standard was first adopted by OSHA. And that was really the first change that they had done in the standard since the mid-1980s. That was a huge one. That is what brought us safety data sheets instead of material safety data sheets. So we went from MSDSs to SDSs. It also brought us the pictogram system and warning signals, the signal words that had to be on the labels, a new format for safety data sheets. There were a lot of changes that were made in 2012. And, I'm going to say this up front, by comparison, the revision done 12 years later for 2024 has a modest impact, but it has an impact nonetheless. And as practitioners of safety, you need to be aware of what's going on out there because this new rule does take effect very, very soon. So we're going to be going through all of that. Now, why did OSHA even embark on the global harmonization system? Was it required by the UN? No. Global Harmonization, or GHS, is a voluntary system, and it was years in the making. It started, back at the Rio Earth Summit that they had, and it took decades for the nations of the UN to agree upon a system of building blocks to try to bring harmony into hazard communication. They wanted to globally harmonize things so that it would facilitate international trade. That's a good thing, that workers in any nation would be able to know by looking at a picture on a label whether this is something that not only presented a hazard, but the type of hazard that it would present. Similarly, global harmonization was integrated into things like environmental protection and transportation of hazardous materials, both domestically here in the US and of course, internationally. So the goal of this, and really the benefits, as we've seen over the past 12 years, has been safer transportation and handling and use of chemicals by and large. We're still having train derailments and things of that can't be necessarily predicted, but at least we have a better idea what is in the trains when they tip over. And this is true. I had a case years ago where a boxcar launched itself while it was parked at a cement plant 2 miles. They ended up evacuating a town because nobody could tell what was in that boxcar. And that was before you had some of the better placarding, and communications that we have today. It was a very scary time, a cool case in a sense from a lawyer and the safety professional's perspective, not a cool case from the employer's perspective, from, the ATF, FBI, Chemical Safety Board, National Transportation Safety Board, and the local state and local police, who all became engaged in this, plus OSHA, of course, and MSHA, because everybody came to play. So if you don't know what's in something that's being transported, and it is indeed, excuse me, hazardous materials, that can take a boxcar and launch it 2 miles. That is a problem. Those are, again, some of the goals here. We had a lot of first responders, and, there are countless incidents, which I won't go through at this point, but we had firefighters who were killed because they went into facilities not knowing what was stored there, and nobody had the proper information available. So this is another benefit of this, in tandem with the Environmental Protection Agency's risk management program, which does have a certain level of interface with that. Also the HazWOPER standards that OSHA has. So all of this comes into play, but there are many, 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 many facilities, the majority of facilities, in fact, that are not covered by HazWOPER or process safety management or anywhere engaged in chemical manufacturing or production, and yet they are very much affected by and covered by the HazCom standard. And again, lots of examples I could give where things are mishandled, resulting in serious casualties. In one case, 27 people ended up going to the hospital. In another, there were 16 people, including children, who were hospitalized when there were problems with appropriate implementation and training on hazard communications. So, while I do say that this is easy pickings for OSHA in terms of writing paperwork citations, I want you all to realize this is serious business, and that is not a phone I control. So I'm sorry, I have no way to reach that or turn it off. We will power through it. It is out of my arm's reach. I'm very sorry about this. Anyway, besides the things that I've spoken about in terms of transportation and chemical handling, we have increased compliance overall in terms of safe chemical handling and management, and workers are protected. Consumers are protected because, remember, the labeling that comes down from on high with OSHA under the OSHA Act and the Hazard Communication Standard, that also impacts the consumer labeling that we see. Yes, the Consumer Product Safety Commission has a dog in that hunt, but the labels on hazardous chemicals do have to conform with OSHA, and that's really a paramount thing. So moving right along here, what do you have to do generally before we get into the changes? The Global Harmonization System, as I said, was a building block system of warnings. It has the recommended desirable format for the safety data sheets. And yes, the US has conformed with that, as have the European Union, Canada, Mexico, and really most of our major trading partners are all following the Global Harmonization System. This makes the transmission of information more consistent. This is based on international negotiations. As we can see, because of this revision, OSHA continues to learn from this process. This is still going on. This is not a once and done, which is why we are here talking about this today. In the end, federal OSHA adopted the number three revision to the Global Harmonization System. This new rule moves us to the 7th revision. There are still meetings that go on at least twice a year, once in the United States, once in Geneva, Switzerland. I've been to a few of the meetings that have been held in DC. I've never been to any of the meetings in Geneva, sadly. But they are continuing to look at chemicals to build on this experience. And this is part of, indeed, of what has gone on here, is the revised classification of certain types of hazards. And so the new rule does not reduce the level of protections either from the 1980s original standard nor from the 2012 iteration of this. It simply builds on that experience and now is reclassifying certain types of chemicals in a way that the UN and our trading partners all agree is a more appropriate way to classify and manage these chemicals. So that's really what we're about here. The global harmonization system, again, it defines and it classifies the chemical hazards, and it continues to revise its approach to that, not on an annual basis. Obviously, they're continuing to change the revisions. We're going to be falling behind again. This change will be needed again in the future, but it also helps to dictate how this information will be communicated on your safety data sheets. And comparing that to OSHA's HazWOPER standard, just because I did throw that out there earlier, that is the code or acronym for Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response Standards. That covers both general industry and construction, and that also deals with potential exposures to hazardous substances. So to effectively implement your HazWOPER program, you're going to want to be aware of the changes to the Hazard Communication Standard. You're going to want to make sure that those programs are in sync. And the good news is, where you are also covered by the Clean Air Act's Risk Management Program, the EPA is already on the 7th revision. To the extent that your duties involve placarding or bills of lading for transportation of hazardous chemicals, good news, the U.S. Department of Transportation was already on the 7th revision. The problem is the OSHA rulemaking took so darn long that they started it on the 3rd revision, and that's where the final rule ended up. So we're really playing catch up, in a sense, to the other U.S. agencies as well. It's not just our foreign partners that are dictating that. So on to the main event here and the 2024 final rule. First of all, as I mentioned, the 2012 revision was the first real change to the standard that was originally adopted in 1983. And interestingly, interesting to me, probably not to anybody else, my first involvement with OSHA was writing comments for my employer on the original HazCom rule, and they were also working on an indoor air quality rule at the same time. But the first HazCom rule was very narrow. It really was limited to the chemical industry. And then a few years later, they broadened it to include all employers who had what OSHA deemed hazardous chemical exposures or use. And newsflash, that's pretty much every employer. There are certainly some purely administrative businesses. My law office would be a good example. We don't do our own cleaning. Our building management company has a janitorial service. We have somebody who services our copiers and things like that. So there's virtually no hazardous chemicals that we use. However, if you have employees, say, at a workplace that are, as part of their assigned duties, even using things like Clorox or Windex, or Ajax, or, I don't mean to be naming a bunch of brand names, but, common household chemicals, they are using them in a way different from how, as the old Hecklinger's company used to say, Harry and Harriet homeowner would be using them, maybe to clean your kitchen once a week, or, you spray a bit of Lysol on your counters and clean those, multiple times a day, but you're not doing this 8 hours a day as your occupation. So for janitors, they would be covered by the HazCom standard because they are using these chemicals that contain bleach and other things. You look at the labels, it may say, use in ventilation. Those are kind of a flash to you that, hey, maybe these are consumer products, but I may be using them in a way beyond a typical consumer use. And so that's how a lot of these employers tend to get drawn in. Now, obviously manufacturers, construction companies, you have maintenance shops, you're going to have a whole array of products in there. Again, they can be bought over the counter by, the mom or dad who do work on their own cars, but you're using those in a way that is much different. And so that brings them into the scope of the HazCom standard. So this is far beyond just chemical manufacturers or producers or those who handle or transport those materials. So everybody's covered by this. It is now, as of 2023, it was OSHA's #2 most cited standard, and there were over 3,200 HazCom citations issued just with federal OSHA, and that's only half the country. There are 22 states that run their own OSHA programs, and their standards have to be at least as stringent as federal OSHA, although they can be more stringent. Definitely California has a whole lot more things dealing with chemical hazards, through Prop 64 than OSHA ever envisioned. And so Cal OSHA, you're going to be dealing with additional warnings, just as an example for those of you who might be multi-state employers. Now, OSHA did note, and I don't have it in the slides here, but state plan states will have to adopt this new 7th revision rule. And they can go beyond that and be more stringent like Cal OSHA, but they have to be at least as stringent. So that means Maryland, which runs its own OSHA program, and also Virginia, which runs its own OSHA program. We have MOSH and VOSH, or VOSH, MOSH and VOSH. They will have to do a rulemaking on this. It'll be fairly pro forma. I don't see them making any alterations to it. But typically that happens within about 6 months. So it's something to keep an eye on. And if you do have any comments, there'll be the opportunity to weigh in through the Maryland OSHA and the Virginia OSHA rulemaking processes. But through our area here, DC, will be covered by this rule. Delaware, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, all of which are kind of within the Chesapeake Region Safety Council's region. They are all federal OSHA. They will all be covered by this rule on the timetable I'll be talking about. And then the state plan probably will be about 6 months down the road after that, unless they decide to do their timing in sync with the federal rule. Again, this is paperwork intensive, and with the changes to this, what paperwork will be changing for you? Well, you may be changing your chemical inventory list. You're going to have to look at the individual chemicals affected by this and see if their classification changed, or maybe they changed the product formulation to avoid having to change and maybe strengthen warnings on it. Those are things that could be a flag for you as we go through the types of products that would be affected by this. So you're going to be keeping an eye on that. Obviously, when you get new safety data sheets from your upstream chemical manufacturers or distributors or importers, you're going to want to compare it with the old one and see how, have they flagged changes? Is it a new revision? Does it have a new date on it? If so, out with the old, in with the new. But of course, under the medical records access rule and the HazCom standards, you have to keep copies of the old safety data sheets for essentially period of employment, plus I think it's 30 years, because many of the diseases that are chemical related manifest after a long latency period, which can be 20 or 30 years. And so employees have the right to know not only what they were exposed to during work, but what was it made of? What were the warnings that the employer knew about at the time? Although the employer's claims typically would be workers' comp, we have an awful lot of temporary workers now mingled within our workforce, the fissured workforce, as it were, the day laborers, the gig workers, as well as contractors. And if they're exposed to a hazardous chemical on your watch and they manifest, chemical or neurological damage after the fact, they also want to be able to go back and see a historical record of what warnings were on the safety data sheet at the time that they were working at your premises. So that's one reason why you have to keep all of this stuff. How are you managing that paper? Is it retrievable? These are all some things to think about. I can certainly remember, I'm old enough, I'm real old, but microfiche were things that you don't even half of you don't even know what I mean by that. But they used to keep copies of newspapers on these transparencies that you'd then put under a reader. Well, companies were using those for old records too. Then we went to the various storage media and, CDs. Okay. There's lots of dropouts. The data, it turns out, is not forever and ever meant on CDs. How about thumb drives? I've had thumb drives corrupted. The point being, you've got to keep this data in a way that it can be retrieved, because it's not going to be an excuse to OSHA if you cannot retrieve it. And down the road, there's a spoliation concept in tort litigation, where if a record was supposed to, by law, be maintained and you don't have it, then it could be used against you. The inference would be that whatever would be in that record would be harmful, in this case, to the employer's litigation position. So it is very important to keep good records. So chemical inventory lists, safety data sheets are going to be changing as a result of this new rule. And what else changes? Well, training. If you have new chemical hazards, or you've got new information that you have to transmit to the employees who are using those hazardous chemicals, that means you've got to train on it. That means you need to document your training as well. So all of those things are going on. Plus, as I've said, the interface and the obligations it may create under the HazWOPR standard, process safety management, even your emergency action plan rules. And of course, there's also the emergency responders rulemaking that OSHA has going on right now. I'll mention they kicked the comment deadline out again on that to, I believe, July 22nd. Don't take that to the bank, but I think July 22nd is the new date. And so if you read this new rule, it may engender some thoughts that you want to communicate as to that rulemaking as well. So none of these things really happen in an isolation chamber. There is interface, as you can see, between the various and sundry rules. And indeed, going back to my MSHA side of the fence for a moment, their HazCom training has to be incorporated into their Part 46 and their Part 48 training, including that training for contractors. So don't forget to document it that way as well. Now, the final rule, the 2024 rule, takes effect July 19th, 2024. That's coming right up. That's less than a month from today for those watching in real time, and for those of you who may be looking at this on a recording. I hope that ship hasn't sailed on you. But don't get too startled, because there are staggered dates for compliance depending upon who you are and where you're situated. And for employers, this is going to be a ways down the road. But again, you've got to start planning, even budgeting for training, for changes that you may need to make. So for chemical manufacturers, importers, and distributors who have to evaluate and change the warnings for their substances and the classification of those chemicals, the compliance deadline is January 19th, 2026. And for mixtures, which are a bit more difficult to test and assess, that deadline will be July 19th, 2027. And then for employers, you get 6 months beyond those dates. So for substances, it's July 20th, 2026. And for mixtures, January 19th, 2028. What do you have to do as an employer at those points? Well, this is where, the rubber meets the road. If you are doing alternative workplace labeling, you have to update that. So your temporary mixtures, for example, or your temporary containers that you're putting a label on, when you're replacing labels on a product because the labels got, destroyed in some way, defaced, they faded, you have to make sure they align with the new rule. You have to update your written hazard communication program. Again, low-hanging fruit. And that's the deadline for doing it. It does not mean you can't do some of this sooner. And also provide that additional training for your workers for the newly identified physical, health, and other hazards that have either been identified under the 7th revision and now are being communicated through the new labeling system and the new safety data sheets, or where your products have been reclassified under the final rule. And up until that date, you can comply with the current rule, and you can also comply with the new standard. So they will not penalize you, for getting out ahead of everybody else. And if you rely on third parties to do your training, that may be something to consider, getting it out of the way once, these training courses are up and running under the 7th revision, so that you can have that documented. And as new safety data sheets and new products with new labels start rolling in, because again, remember, the chemical manufacturers, their last deadline date to do this is January 19th, 2026. It doesn't mean that later in 2024 or throughout 2025, you're not going to start seeing products coming in with the new information. So you're really going to have to stay frosty during this whole period of time is kind of the takeaway there. Some of the revisions to note now, this is again going down to the next layer on this rule. The change really focuses on improving the amount and the quantity of information on labels, especially on small products, to better communicate that information to those who are using the products. They want workers and also the first responders to be able also to use data sheets, the safety data sheets, as an up-to-date reference for first aid provision, for determining what personal protective equipment is needed, for determining the emergency protocols, because there are some products where if they're both in, say, a warehouse that goes on fire, and as a result of it catching on fire, some of the separations are destroyed, you now have, things, I think of the West Texas, explosion and fire there that essentially took out a town. Those are the kind of things that hazard communication and the risk management programs are intended to prevent. So hopefully, as a result of these new changes being implemented, there won't be another West Texas. The first responders, the employers, in whose facilities these products are being stored, would be able to communicate in a better, more timely and effective manner to prevent those kind of really catastrophic events from occurring. They have changed 12 definitions in the rule. And again, these are a fair bit far out, from now. But if these apply to you, this is where you're going to want to make note. You're going to want to look at what you're currently using. You're going to want to match it up against the revised definitions. Bulk shipment is one term. They're aligning that, remember, with DOT. That's a good thing. Combustible dust. Again, West Texas, that was an implication there. The Imperial Sugar Factory fire that blew up and killed 14 people because of combustible dust. I've personally handled a situation a couple of years ago where there was combustible dust at a manufacturing facility in another state. One worker was killed, another was severely burned, did survive, but it was an absolutely horrendous recovery that he went through and is still going through. And had this new revision been in effect, I dare say that might have prevented that condition from occurring. Gas, that definition has changed. Also, immediate outer package. These are things that are going to apply more to the manufacturers and the distributors than to the employers. Liquid, the definition has changed. Physician or other licensed healthcare professional, the term released for shipment, and finally the term solid. So solid, liquid, and gas, those terms all being revised. That's a pretty good signal for you that you have some work to do if you are the industrial hygienist or the chemicals manager for your company. They've also revised definitions for exposure and exposed, hazardous chemical, and also physical hazard. OSHA removed pyrophoric gas from the definitions that were included in the 2012 version. So, if you have training materials from 2012, which most of us do, those are going to have to be altered before you do training under the new rule. And so again, the final rule now aligns with DOT, EPA for the terms released for shipment and also bulk shipments. That should simplify things for those of you who may be in the logistics sector and transportation sector. In addition, there are now special labeling provisions for 3 milliliter and 100 milliliter containers. And that is similar to what the Canada HazCom system known as WHMIS, WHMIS, uses. There's also a shift to mandatory use of prescribed concentration ranges when the exact percentages are claimed as a trade secret. And again, that aligns with the Canadian WHMIS. This is really going to help us in across the border trade with Canada, where right now there are definite challenges in the documents that a manufacturer in the US can send for products that are going to be sold even in a Target or a Walmart across the border. So again, good news here. A little bit of work in the transition period, but should pay some dividends down the road. Now, there were several appendices to the 2012 version of the HazCom rule, and those have been updated. So again, you know, a lot of stuff here, certainly more than we're going to cover in an hour to get deep into the weeds, but this is what I want you to be aware of. Appendix A, there are changes now revising health hazard definitions, specifically those dealing with skin corrosion and irritation and eye damage chapters to the 7th revision. And then, yes, non-animal test methods. If you are a chemical manufacturer, you're going to be potentially doing animal and non-animal testing. The non-animal testing, you're now going to be following the 8th revision to the UN Global Harmonization System. So we are going to have a few little things from further chapters poking their heads up. You know, we're not going all the way to where what they're working on now. Maybe in another decade or a dozen years, if OSHA's still around, if we're all still around. I don't know if I'll still be doing safety in a dozen years, but you never can tell. Maybe there'll be another revision. It probably won't be to the 8th revision. Maybe it'll be to a 10th revision. So stay tuned for that. Appendix B has changes now, again, aligning with the 7th revision for physical hazards. So that includes chemical products like flammable gases, which many of my clients, you know, have those for various and sundry uses. Desensitized explosives. I work with the 2 major blasting companies in the US, so this rule is going to impact them in a big way. And then aerosols are impacted by Appendix B changes as well. Moving down to Appendix C of the HazCom rule. Again, that has updated things to align with the 7th revision for labeling. So there's new hazards, there's new guidance, there's new hazard and precautionary statements that will be coming on the new labels that you're going to be seeing most likely starting next year, but definitely on all products by 2026. And then on the products that you as a downstream employer may create, you know, in some way, you know, hocus pocus in your manufacturing, that is going to be covered starting in 2028. And then finally, Appendix D, that was the provision changing us from material safety data sheets to safety data sheets. And now with the 7th revision, there are going to be further revisions on that 16 section safety data sheet to sections 2, 3, 9, and 11. But those are the only sections of the safety data sheets that will be affected by this change, at least according to OSHA so far. They have not put out a huge amount of guidance on this, by the way. So, you know, I'm giving you kind of a bare bones analysis here. They are going to be clarifying, I'm sure, some additional changes as time goes on. I also don't know if there is going to be litigation over this. There's litigation typically over every OSHA rule that comes out. And this one, I hate to say it this way, but I will. This got rushed to the finish line because we are in an election year. Just like the 2 MSHA rules I'm going to be talking about at the webinar next month, just like the OSHA walk-around rights rule that came out and took effect on May 31st. Some of these rules maybe would have been improved if they took a bit more time on them, I will say. But there's a thing called the Congressional Review Act. And if there is a change in party at the executive branch level, which would be the presidency and flowing down from that to OSHA, and there's also a Congress that I'll say adheres to the new president's party, they can use the Congressional Review Act to rescind, to kill any rule that the previous administration put out within 180 legislative days of the new administration, at Congress convening. Now, legislative days are kind of like dog years. You can't count them on your fingers and toes because they don't count holidays and they don't count recesses. And right now, Congress is still in effect, of course, the previous Congress. But what does this really mean? Is there an impact of this? Is this hypothetical threat? It isn't hypothetical. Just to give you some context, and the old timers probably remember this, the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton, not Hillary, was the president. And at the very end of his administration, literally in January, right before the changeover to George W. Bush, OSHA put out its ergonomics standard. And we had a shift. We had a Republican president succeed a Democratic president. And for the first 2 years, George W. Bush had a Republican majority in the House and the Senate. And so they used the Congressional Review Act. It was the first time in history it was ever used to kill the OSHA ergonomics standard. And once a rule is killed under the Congressional Review Act, it means that never again can that agency promulgate a similar rule without the express permission of Congress. And so that all occurred in 2001. We still don't have a federal ergonomics standard, even as some of the state plan states have tackled that issue. But wait, there's more. A little bit closer in history, the Obama administration had been told that they could no longer issue citations for record-keeping violations that went back more than 180 days because OSHA's 180-day statute of limitations. But in that case, the court invited OSHA to do a rulemaking, giving itself the power to issue citations for as long as you had to keep the records. Okay, you have to keep OSHA logs 5 years. So they did that. They did a rulemaking. And again, it came out in January at the very end of the Obama administration. And we know what happened there. President Trump was elected. He got a red Congress. And for the second time, they used the Congressional Review Act to kill an OSHA rule. And so, at this point, OSHA cannot issue citations going back more than 180 days for paperwork violations. I suppose in the context of the HazCom paperwork intensive standard, that's a good thing as well. But you have a real-time obligation, obviously, to be protecting workers against chemical hazards. So as a practical matter, they can usually show that there has been some exposure within 180 days. So nice try, but you're not getting out under that one. My point, however, being that, remember, I said this rule came out May 20th. That is just about the drop deadline for being outside of that 180 legislative days. People have been asking me about it, and I always said, if it's out by the middle of May or so, the agency will be safe. And anything, if you push it past Memorial Day, they're cooked. So they got in just under the wire there, and here we are. In terms of changing these classifications for hazards, what do they have in the rule? First of all, the hazard classification for the substance or the mixture now is going to have to consider the chemical's intrinsic properties. This is the kicker, including any change in chemical physical form or chemical reaction products associated with known or reasonably anticipated uses or applications of the chemical. So that now is going to require manufacturers to better anticipate what their downstream customers may use this chemical for, or commingle it, mix it with. Will it create a combustible dust? Will it create, something that is going to be flammable now or explosive where it wasn't before? They've created a new hazard class, desensitized explosives, new hazard categories for unstable gases, and pyrophoric gases are now just in the flammable gas category. They are no longer a separate pyrophoric gas classification within the HazCom system. And again, this is going forward. Right now, you can still comply with the basic rule as it is. But the non-flammable aerosols are included as hazards within the aerosols class. Now, there's also revisions to the health hazard statements and precautionary statements, depending upon which of the chemicals are involved. And as I mentioned before, they're really focused on changing the terms skin corrosion and irritation, the definitions of those, and also serious eye damage and eye irritation. And I don't know if it's surprising or not surprising, but I will tell you, just a couple of years ago, while this rule was in development, suddenly we saw eye protection coming onto the list of the 10 most cited OSHA standards for the first time. It actually knocked electrical citations off of the chart for the top 10 hit parade. So I'm assuming, that could be dangerous, that OSHA was getting a lot more hospitalizations, immediate reportable cases of serious eye injuries, finding that they related to chemical hazards. And that is actually one of their triage criteria when they get one of these immediate reportable things, where you need to notify them within 24 hours of somebody being hospitalized or an eye loss. You have to notify them as well. Maybe running this to ground and finding that the warnings on the chemical products were inadequate. I will tell you, I was actually an expert witness in a case a number of years ago where, due to inferior warnings on a safety data sheet, somebody got cement dust in their eye and they started flooding it, and it created concrete, a chemical lime reaction in their back of their eyeball. And you might imagine that was a kind of a condition you don't come back from. It was a very bad situation for that individual. And so again, these are not hypothetical injuries we're talking about. I have seen them in real time. So that's what they're talking about here. So in terms of the impact on safety data sheets and labels under the new rule, the only products really that are going to be impacted are those that are going to have the new classification criteria. So all aerosol products you're going to be looking at. You're going to be looking for new safety data sheets. You're going to be looking for new labels. You're going to be looking for chemical product changes that are going to impact your chemical inventory list. And you're going to be retraining workers potentially on the use of these. Same thing for desensitized explosives and flammable gases. If you are an affected establishment, workplace is what OSHA means, you have to update those labels and the safety data sheets. Those are the chemical manufacturers, and then the downstream employers who use or handle those have to update their training and their documents accordingly. Trade secrets, OSHA is looking at with a little bit more strict scrutiny here. And I do have some clients that have trade secrets, but you know, a lot of companies use that to really keep a shield up, which prevented their employees and also first responders from really being able to assess accurately the chemical hazards to which they were going to be exposed. So that is changing as part of the changes to the safety data sheets. The safety data sheets are going to have to either be stored on site or electronically available for all covered chemicals and commercial products that you're using in a commercial way, as opposed to, again, Harriet homeowner, and which are being stored on site. Word of warning on the electronically available. I'm involved in a case right now down in Texas with OSHA following that big storm they had several weeks ago where the derecho came through. And the power was out for a full week at my client's manufacturing facility where this crane came down over in a construction area. And you know, they had no way to electronically retrieve any kind of documents, much less safety data sheets. And that was throughout that whole area, Houston and its environs. And, you know, there's more flooding going on down there. We've got it in Florida. We're having extreme weather. Please consider the impact of extreme weather on your electronic storage information, because you may well need access to those safety data sheets, especially if people are trying to take precautions to shut you down safely in the event of a power outage. And you know, you may have pipelines with ammonia and other stuff going through your workplace. You've got to make sure that you have this information available, even if the lights go out, okay? And OSHA will hold you accountable for that. For bulk shipments And again, we're aligning that with DOT and EPA. They've harmonized those labeling requirements, and it simplifies, you're not going to have to do the dual labeling requirement down the road. So for those entities who right now are struggling under that, getting on board with this sooner rather than later will make sense. Why wait until 2028 if you can get down to one label now? The rule also clarifies, and this is a big deal for some of my employers that I deal with who do have warehousing and logistics operations, you do not have to open sealed pallets and boxes of containers to relabel them under this rule. You do not have to repackage products that come in a pre-printed bag. You know, your current inventory, you can continue getting rid of and using as you would normally use it. But do keep an eye on that 2028 date. Guidance from OSHA down to that point, 4 years hence, they may expect you to be revising products if you are not getting this information from the chemical manufacturers and your distributors. So do keep an eye on that. But in the moment, you can continue to use everything packaged and labeled as it is. You don't need to open up pallets, and you can pass them on to third parties as is. Now, in terms of the current standard, because of course, that is what OSHA is enforcing. Just wanted to remind you, the maximum penalty went up to $161,000 per violation as of January 16th, 2024. And they also passed what they call the IBI program, or instance by instance citation policy. And so OSHA now has the power, if you have, say, a chemical release and you have 10 employees who are exposed to it, and there's a HazCom violation that arises from that, they can issue 10 citations, one for each affected employee, each one with a separate penalty. And if it's serious, if it's willful or repeat, it can be up to 161,000 times 10. You're in the Mega Millions jackpots all of a sudden. And similarly, if you have multiple things that are cited under a single standard, typically OSHA groups those. But if they decide that you meet the criteria for an instance by instance citation employer, and that part of that depends on your track record of previous violations, I will say, then they can issue multiple citations. So to give you an example, I have a client that maybe doesn't have proper warnings on 3 different types of chemicals. The labels are off of them. Usually OSHA would give you 1 citation, and it would have item 1A, 1B, and 1C, but a single penalty. And the first one might be, product A, the second one would be product B, third would be product C. Under the IBI instance by instance citation approach, they can give you a separate citation for product A with penalty of up to 161 grand, separate one for product B, separate one with separate penalty for product C, and so on. So the stakes are definitely getting higher. And that program really only rolled out about a year ago, so they're still feeling it. It'll certainly continue into the next administration if it is under a Democratic president, and it'll certainly die the death of a dog if it is under a Republican presidency. But that's how things roll. So under the current HazCom standard, the most cited sections, first one is 1910-1200 E1, which is having the written HazCom program that describes, your labeling, your forms of warning, your safety data sheets, how you're going to meet all of your obligations for training and information communication. They issued over 1,100 citations for that last year. The next one is 1910.1200 H1. That is employee training on chemicals that they either haven't been trained about before or where there is new information on them. And that is, again, going to be likely your training obligation that will be cited under this new rule revision. The next most cited was 1910.1200 G8. And that is keeping the good old safety data sheets, tiptoe through the binder, and, almost inevitably you're missing a safety data sheet for the one product they pull out of your storage cabinet. Make sure somebody is auditing this. get rid of the safety data sheets for products that you know you're no longer using. Remember that these aren't really transferable necessarily from one brand to the other. You've got a safety data sheet for, Duron primer paint, and somebody comes back from the store with a generic brand and they don't have a safety data sheet for it. The formulation may be different. That will get you into trouble with OSHA. That's why, they issue a lot of citations under this standard. The next one is 1910.1200 F6, workplace labeling. Usually you get the products labeled from the manufacturer. So this is typically either where the label has become degraded, it's fallen off, it's been bleached out, so you can't read it anymore, or the employer maybe created a mixture themselves in the workplace and they didn't put any kind of label on it. And finally, 1910.1200 G1, and that is the chemical manufacturers and importers have to obtain or develop a safety data sheet, and employers have to have that in the workplace as well. Slightly different from maintaining them and making them accessible to workers, which was the previous one under G8. So again, nuke them all and let God sort them out. They come in, you're not with the program. You can expect you'd probably get 5 separate citations under these separate subparts. And today that could be each one cited separately with a separate penalty. And whether you're talking about 16 grand as a basic serious or other than serious citation, or you're talking 161 grand, that's still a lot of money when you start multiplying it by 5 or 10. So bear that in mind. Also, as I've mentioned a little bit, there are still some exceptions to which chemicals are covered under HazCom. Hazardous waste is covered by the EPA under RCRA, which is a separate environmental statute. And then OSHA's overlap with that is the HazWOPR rule, which I mentioned previously. There are chemicals for sure in food additives, drugs, and cosmetics, some of which are ones that are regulated in the workplace, like respirable crystalline silica. But when those chemicals are present in a food or food additive, drug, or cosmetic, then the Food and Drug Administration has regulatory authority over them, and they have their own type of things, Food Chemical Codex, among other things. Beyond that, consumer products, I mentioned that already. You've got the Consumer Product Safety Act, and also the Federal Hazardous Substances Act that has a bit of a skin in that game. Pesticide products, rather than those being regulated by OSHA under the HazCom standard, they are controlled by EPA under FIFRA, which is the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. And then non-industrial alcohol, the kind that many of you probably will be enjoying coming up soon for the 4th of July. That is regulated by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and enforced by the Treasury Department. But industrial alcohol, which is used obviously in a lot of manufacturing processes, that would be covered by OSHA under the HazCom rule. So bartenders, you don't have to keep a safety data sheet for your Tanqueray and Bombay gin back there. But if you have industrial alcohol and products that you're using to clean off the bar, that would be covered under the HazCom standard. So those are the distinctions there. We are at the top of the hour here, and I do want to take, if there are any questions on the new rule, I just want to note for you who may be coming back to look at these materials that I've included in this deck, essentially the basic requirements here. There has to be a hazard classification, and some of those are changing under this rule, and they have to identify both the health and the physical hazards, as well as classify mixtures, and that's where supplemental testing very often may be needed. Labeling. The chemical manufacturers provide a label that includes the harmonized signals word, the pictograms, I mentioned those earlier, and also the hazard statements. Those are not really changing in the pictograms and all of that. What is changing are which ones might apply to specific products. It might have had one pictogram previously, and under the 2024 rule, a different pictogram will be used. This format for the safety data sheets, the 16 section format, everybody is using those at this point. And then you have to train your workers to recognize the hazards, to facilitate their understanding of safety data sheets. And, newsflash, the training needs to be done in a language and a vocabulary that workers will understand. Many companies are now having bilingual safety data sheets, because if everybody reads Spanish and all your safety data sheets are in English, they're not going to be effective in an emergency. So your responsibilities are to ensure labels are on the incoming packages, not defaced, that you're maintaining the safety data sheets for shipments and replacing the old ones with the newer ones, but keeping the old ones for historical purposes, making sure the safety data sheets are accessible to your workers, making sure that the chemicals you're using in your workplace are properly labeled, tagged, or marked. Provide that information and training to your employees and to others, employees in a multi-employer workplace. This is, again, something that people get tagged on a lot. You may not be using any chemicals, but you're a temporary agency who sent workers in, and they are working alongside people who are being exposed to ethyl methyl death. They require the same training. They require the same personal protective equipment. You also have to have that written hazard communication program. And again, remember, over 1,100 citations were issued last year just under that section of the HazCom standard alone. So this illustrates, how things flow. It starts with the manufacturers. It goes down to the employers, and the employers then have to ensure the labeling and the training and the safety data sheets are provided and available to their workers and anybody else on the work site who may have exposures. I'm going to move through these because they're fairly simplistic, but safety data sheets, remember we talked about Section 2, Section 3, Section 9, and Section 11 are those sections that will be impacted by the 2024 rule. So when you get new safety data sheets, compare the new with the old, and those sections are the ones you really want to hammer in on and look at. And if if there is new information, then at that point, out with the old, in with the new, and that's the point when you should be training your workers, in my view, on the new information on those safety data sheets. Don't just stick them in a drawer. Make sure you are communicating that information. I already talked about some of the hazard determination, and again, this is really more for the chemical producers themselves and how they're labeling them. This is what the pictograms look like, and again, same old. We aren't introducing new ones, but we are changing which ones of these may be applying. We talked about skin corrosion definitions changing, so look for that. We talked about the explosives, some of those changes. We talked about the gas changes. So all of those products may be impacted, and watch for changes in the pictograms on the labels. For your training, manufacturers rely on employers doing training as a defense in their tort liability actions, and that's why they give you the information you need to conduct that training. So make sure you're doing it. Train your workers. Exchange information with your local emergency responders. If you have some truly bad, juju in there, in drums or something on your property, train people who are preparing your labels and safety data sheets and who are doing your HazCom management. That all needs to be part of your risk management system. And then these systems should also educate your downstream consumers to understand the risks and the protections for the products that you are giving them. That you're selling them, you're probably not giving them to them. What you have to train workers on, because this is really the lodestar of all of this. Workers have a right to know. They call this the community right to know piece of the puzzle for community hazard communication and on-site. Workers have the right to know and understand the hazardous chemicals they use and how to work with them safely. So you train them before their initial assignment. You train them again when new hazards are introduced. You train them when they're going to use chemicals in a non-routine task, because maybe you did the training on this, but it was 1.5 years ago and they haven't used that chemical since then, and it's got some unique characteristics. Repeat that training. Make sure to train them on the methods and observations to determine the release of it. Do they smell it? Do they have to watch for big bang? What are they supposed to be on the lookout for? What are the hazards of the chemicals? What are the appropriate protective measures? Where can they get additional information? And again, training in a language and a vocabulary that the worker can understand. And remember, in tandem with HazCom, OSHA very often will issue a citation for PPE hazard assessment. It also is a commonly cited standard, and their field operations manual. The inspectors are told to ask for the employer's written PPE assessment, which has to be in writing for general industry. It doesn't for construction, but how in the heck do you prove that you did it if it's not in writing? You've got to include chemical hazards as part of the foreseeable hazards in doing your PPE assessment. And the safety data sheet is the Rosetta Stone. It's where you go to find out what PPE is needed to safely work with that chemical. So if OSHA comes in, you have people working with chemicals. OSHA looks at the safety data sheet. It says goggles with side shields, and you have people wearing regular prescription glasses. You're going to get a citation for the goggles. You're going to get a citation for HazCom training, and you're also going to get a citation for an inadequate PPE assessment under 29 CFR 1910.132. So again, remember, your workers who have to wear PPE also has to be trained on the effective use of it, including putting it on, taking it off, cleaning it if it's reusable, storing it safely if it's reusable, like a respirator, and also be aware of its limitations. So those are all parts of the HazCom puzzle. Contractors, they are humans too. You can't leave them out. As I said, everybody on your work site, you as the controlling employer have an obligation to protect. You need to let them know what chemicals you may be using. You need to find out from them what they may be bringing on site that your workers may be exposed to. And remember, you're communicating with your contractors, not only about hazardous chemicals, but also hazards such as confined space entry, the use of chemicals inside there. I had a case where my client was the contractor. Two of their workers went down because of trichloroethylene in a tank that they were cleaning out. And the host employer said, oh yeah, we tested the atmosphere, it's fine. They tested it, but they neglected to totally get all of the chemical out there. And even wearing half-face respirators, these two guys went to the hospital. So that was what we were cited for. There was failing to communicate about the chemical hazards in addition to the confined space entry. Process safety management communication, asbestos removal, HazWOPR, and emergency response. Remember, OSHA can cite you as the controlling employer, the creating employer, that's the employer who creates the hazard, the exposing employer, that's the employer whose workers are exposed, in this case, to the chemical hazard, even if they're not using the chemical themselves. And finally, the correcting employer, which is the entity either by contract or in practice, has the legal obligation to mitigate the chemical hazard. So those are all things to bear consideration. Bottom line, closing this up here, this is always among the top 5 most cited standards. You can bet on it with the rollout of this new 2024 rule. It could bubble up even to number 1, even though it's currently been holding its place for 2 years at number 2 on the hit parade. Training of your workers has to be done prior to using the chemicals, and it must be documented. You know, as you start buying new products, get the new safety data sheets, look at the new warnings. If they have been stepped up, you know, you may consider product replacement potentially. You know, if this product now has been reassessed as being more hazardous than you previously thought. Pay special attention to the PPE requirement changes because OSHA can enforce those. Watch out for the occupational exposure limits. They are on the safety data sheet. Some of those are being revised. You know, you've got to comply with those as well. The manufacturers, they've got, you know, a double whammy because they are both employers and manufacturers. Again, make sure you store your old safety data sheets under the records access rule and the hazard communication standard, and jot those deadlines that I gave you down now so that they will be a tickler as the enforcement obligations I should say the compliance obligations start bubbling up for you, whether you are a manufacturer, whether you are a distributor, an importer, maybe you are a transporter or logistics manager, or you are the downstream user and employer. So thank you very much. I know I overstayed my welcome, as I do so often here, Dave. Sorry about that. But if there are any questions that I can answer, I'm happy to do so. And I'll turn this back over to you. Thank you again.
No, you never overstay your welcome, Adele. There's
That's
lots
what
of.
I was going to say.
We all learned so much. That's right. So just as a reminder, this presentation was recorded, and Adele's presentation will be available on our website probably by Monday. So with all that great information, please know you can access that in just a couple of days. Okay. And before I take down Adele's slideshow, if you want to grab a screenshot of her contact information. We have Dave Medeiros, our president here. We also have Christy Bliss, our director of the Chesapeake Region Safety Council. Christy will be looking through the chat and the Q&A. So there's a few questions out there. Dave, while I'm sharing my screen, do you want to say hi to our 100 guests while I'm switching out my PowerPoint here?
All right. Well, hey, guess what? Today is the longest day of the year, and it's a Friday freebie. So you already started out with a Friday freebie. So when you go home at the end of the day and you're contemplating everything that went on today, you get a little bit of extra time to celebrate and enjoy how wonderful a presentation that Adele did for us today. We are a chapter of the National Safety Council. We're about educating and influencing people to prevent accidental injury and death, saving lives and preventing injuries. That's what we're all about. And I would love to hear more from you all as we move forward. And we'd love to have you come visit us here at the Chesapeake Region Safety Council and participate in one of our training programs. We have free ones and we have ones that charge a little bit of tuition. But I will tell you, as the president of this council, the people that we have in those classrooms providing the education that you'll get here are the best of the best. And we are those folks that do that education know from me, they know from Christy, and they know from the rest of our staff that we want them to be the best of the best. And they are. They do a great job for us and for everybody that comes in here. So just letting you know, that's a little bit about what we do, and I will turn it back over to Kim.
Yeah, actually, Dave, I'm going to put in the chat here. We do have here at our Baltimore Training Center, we do have an OSHA 2015, the hazardous materials course, coming up in just a couple of weeks. That'll expand on the knowledge you learned from Adele today. It's July 15th to the 18th, and I'll drop that in the chat for those who would be interested in taking that class. And some additional information will be in the chat here as well. Christy, right before you get going here, I don't think my slide showed up earlier for Adele's next webinar with us. So I wanted to make sure I shared that. Adele discussed there's some new MSHA rules. And so July 10th, we'd love to have you back. You can hit the QR code there to register, or just go back to the website where you found this webinar and get registered for that. We'd love to see you on July 10th. And then some...
There you go. You weren't
You
showing
got
the
it.
screen. We
Okay.
didn't see it. So if you want to go back.
It just doesn't want to show
Yeah.
that slide, but I promise
go.
I promise on the safety webinars page on our website, you can get registered there. And we've got some information now available. Our sponsorships, our exhibitor openings, and registration is now open for our Safety and Health Conference. So I wanted to be sure to share that with you as well. And I'll drop some things in the chat, Christy, but I think we've got some Q&As for
Yeah.
Adele and some things in the chat. So Adele, I think we have a couple things for you
Yes,
here.
I did see one question here from Scott. I hope he's still on. And he asked, with these changes, is the HMIS or the Canadian HMIS still viable, or must they change to Global Harmonization System? And the other HMIS, that is still viable. Global harmonization remains a voluntary, again, system of building blocks, and each country kind of selected from that the building blocks that they were going to be adopting. The US, of course, has memorialized and codified the building blocks it selected in this both 2012 rule and now in the 2024 rule. And Canada, they adopted the building blocks they wanted, and those are part of their WMIS rule. And then you have the fire system code, but they have not at this point disturbed that. The goal, though, is to try to get to one system of placarding for transportation and environmental, if at all possible. So that's something to be looking at. And now the other question that I see here was about emergency responders getting hazmat lists and safety data sheets. And, you know, that really was more under the risk management rule of the EPA, as I recall, the duty to share that information under their community right to know environmental provisions rather than the workplace provisions, because again, remember, OSHA's rule is workplace centric. However, part of the goal is if you are an employer that you have that information available to share with your first responders in the event of an emergency. The other part in these boxes of materials, I think that you're talking about were more where, say there was a chemical manufacturer in the community and they needed to know what's being stored on that site in the event of a fire or explosion, similar to the West Texas disaster that we had. And there were some executive orders that came out under the Obama administration in the wake of that. And I think that dictates a bit more of that information transfer. And of course, the EPA was working on a rule flowing out of that as well. But OSHA, their regulations are limited to the workplace. So they don't have legs to get out into the community and cite an employer per se, you know, for not following the EPA regulation, if that makes sense. But those were the two substantive questions I saw. Are there any others out there that you see?
Yeah, Adele, thank you for that. Yeah, and I guess you would call that a best practice then with regard to giving them for them. So
Yeah, I mean, if I'm an employer and I've got ethyl methyl death, you know, in tanks on my property, I definitely want the first responders to have all of that information. And, you know, in all likelihood, some of these sites are probably using them to respond in confined space disasters as well. And so they should be in communication with them about all of those types of hazards just generally, because there's
Right.
that obligation too.
Yeah. Yeah, Joseph had a question about, is there an update or something prepared to further educate HazWAPR trained individuals on these new revisions?
Well, I don't do HazWAPR training myself because that's an 8-hour course, but I would imagine the council will be looking to integrate the new information in,
Yeah.
especially as you get closer to the compliance deadlines.
Yeah, so thank you, Adele, because any of our trainings that reference HazCom will then be updated in HazWAPR and then our 2015 course, which is our hazardous materials class, all of those will have any of the updates that need to be included for those in their trainings. So thank you. Yeah.
And
then,
you know, I want to remind you, I wanted to communicate about the new rule and that is this is going to, for those people who are deeply affected, who have the types of chemicals that are really being impacted here, the gases, the explosives, the aerosols, you're going to want to get more deeply steeped in the requirements and the new definitions of this rule, much more that could be done in this kind of I'll call it the 15,000 foot 1 hour version of it. So the Safety Council, for those of you out there who are in need of this is your go-to source to get the training you're going to need to keep everybody safe.
You're such a good plugger. Thank you for plugging that in. I appreciate that. I also just there was one question in the chat, and I believe it was answered in your presentation, but maybe you can just reiterate. It was about keeping your old SDSs once you're replacing them. Can you just reference that again?
Yes, again, you'll want to look at the medical records access rule, which is 1910.1020. And that also is the rule that requires you to keep employee health records, your medical surveillance records, x-rays and sampling records where you're sampling for toxic chemicals. And then they also want you to keep the historical versions of the safety data sheets. And this is also addressed in the HazCom standard. So
Yeah.
just, you can scan them, you can keep them on a thumb drive, you can keep them on a hard drive, you can send them to the cloud. Just make sure they are retrievable. And as storage media go out of fashion, that you transfer that data over. I had a box with 300 of those little hard 3x4 hard discs. And I realized we no longer in my entire law firm have a single computer that will play them. So there's an example.
Yeah. So, I guess I want to elaborate on that question that I just asked too, because they want to confirm with people that use an online provider to house the SDSs. Are those online providers required to hold the old versions as well once they get updated?
And they aren't, because they're not employers, so they're not subject to OSHA. What you want to look at is your contractual language. Are they committing to you that they will have that record preservation? If they don't have that, maybe you don't want to use that online provider.
Okay, yeah, good point. Wow, okay. And then I just had a quick question too with regards to some of the changes that are happening with the appendices, A, B, and C, that where you're going to see those. Where would you recommend people to best see all those changes when they're finalized?
Well, I mean, it is fine in the final rule.
Well, yeah.
And so, you could tackle that monster if you want to want to read several hundred pages in the Federal Register. But again, more to the point, for example, in Appendix D, that deals with the safety data sheets. There's not a lot employers have to do other than know that those sections, section 2, 3, 9, and 11, are the ones that would be changing. And so I'm trying to throw a flag up that, hey, when you get a new safety data sheet in from, Abrams Chemical, for this product, look at those sections. If it's still the same language, then it's not a new version. If it is a new version, that now to me is setting up the flare that I have a new training obligation. If I'm still using that product, if I'm not using the product anymore, then there's no big difference. But if there is new hazard information, of course you have to train the employees to recognize those unique aspects. Maybe the PPE has changed on it now. So those are the things that the employers have the responsibility for, not writing them, but reviewing them and then putting them into practice.
Perfect. All right. Well, Adele, I think that I don't, just double checking.
Did we catch the online SDS provider question?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep.
Great.
We got that one. And I should say already has red strike line versions of appendices. Bruce.
And somebody has very helpfully told us that page 119 to 123 is the table that changes. And Jessica, thank you for that. And hopefully they align with what I've told you here today.
Yeah. I just want to make sure those that are on this knew of a place to go other than, what you have provided too. So thank you. I believe that that updates everything, Kim. I think we are.
Yeah, I think so too. If folks have questions later, they know where to find us so we can get some answers to them. Yeah.
I've got one more thing, Kim. Miss Kim Beard, I think, and I saw it earlier. Did you have a slide that showed the work zone safety pledge?
I did. I'll pull that QR code up. I'll try to pull the QR code up, but what I can do quickly is put that right in the chat here, Dave.
All right. Well, hey, everybody that's on this thing, I just would like to ask you to take a look at our website, or if it comes up, slide comes up, we have established something called a work zone safety pledge. Within less than a mile of our facility, a little over a year ago, there were 6 workers killed in a work zone crash where the 2 drivers of the vehicles were traveling through a work zone in excess of 100 miles an hour. And it was a terrible tragedy. But one of the things we're trying to do, the state legislature has passed some law changes to try to improve protections of workers in work zones. But one of the things we'd like to do is get everybody to get a little skin in the game. And if you see our webpage or in the chat, we have a little work zone safety pledge. Basically, you scan the QR code, you take the pledge. There's 3 fundamental rules right there, that QR code. If you take your phone, you aim it at that QR code, you hit it, it'll take you to the work zone safety pledge page. And basically it's asking you to take this pledge. 3 fundamentals you need to exercise when you're traveling through a work zone. Slow down, move over, and pay attention. So basically taking the pledge gets you to trigger yourself. Hey, I took a pledge. When you see a work zone coming up, slow down, move over, and pay attention. And we just like to get you to take that pledge, commit to it with your name and your email. It's not a marketing thing or anything like that. We just want to have solid commitments from people that they're going to do this. If we get the numbers to do it, we're going to start saving lives and preventing injuries a lot better than we are right now in the work zones. So without further ado, that's all I got for you. I thank you all very much for participating in this webinar today, and I hope you got a lot out of it. And I can't thank Adele enough for all of the information she's provided us. So thank you. Have a great extended Friday, and happy summer to all of you. Hope we see
Thank
you back
you.
soon.
Happy summer.
Yep.